Welcome to Beyond Transcripts, the podcast for educators who want to meet and exceed best practices in transcripts and education management. On this episode of Beyond Transcripts, Matt Bass, founder of Transcript Maker, and I are talking all about why private schools are moving toward online learning. First of all, we talk about what we mean when we say online education, because there really is a spectrum of what that is. And we know that people have objections. We know that you might think that, well, your quality of education isn't that great when you're online. But guess what? We're going to prove that idea wrong today. There are so many benefits of being in an online classroom, whether that's meeting different learning styles, giving students flexibility that they need, but also preparing students for college and beyond, because a lot of universities are expecting their students to do some sort of online education, and being able to navigate online and go through these courses really does prepare students for jobs in the future. As a school, there's a lot of reasons why you would want to offer online classes, not just encourage your students to take them. So we cover why you might want to expand into online classes, and if you decide to do that, some of the things that you might want to consider that you haven't even thought about. Matt and I could have talked about this for hours, but we saved the best stuff just for you. Hi, Matt. How are you today?
Doing good, Sarah. How are you?
I'm good. All right. So I have a stat here for us. According to a 2015 report from the International Association for K-12 Online Learning, more than 1.3 million students were enrolled in distance education courses at the high school level. Now, obviously, that stat's already a few years old, so I would assume that number is even higher. But it just sort of confirms why we're talking today about why private schools are moving towards online learning. So let's just start off kind of, I don't want to say basic, but let's just, clarify. When we are talking about online education, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, that's a great question, because a lot of people wondered, does that mean the entire course is online? Does that mean just part of it is online? What qualifies? And so online education in general is kind of a catch-all term, and it can describe all of that stuff. There are some courses where just a small portion of it is online, like maybe you take a weekly exam online, and somebody could consider that to be a hybrid online course. And then there are other courses where you attend a lecture 1 or 2 days a week, and the rest of the time you're at home studying on your own and filling out exams that way, and all the way up to courses that are completely online, where you're watching video online, you're watching the lecture, and you're completing your coursework that way. So it's an entire spectrum.
Right. And even if we think of, programs and coursework, you could have some high school and then even college students that, their entire program is offered through online learning, or they take a course here and there through online learning. And then again, there's that spectrum of within that course, what does that actually mean? Some courses are 100% online, but even within that, there might be what we call sort of live components or synchronous learning, where it's not just a video of the lecture, but maybe the instructor is actually live and people are sitting there in real time watching and can ask questions. So online education, I think, has really evolved from what people tend to think of as online education that can kind of have a bad stigma. So what are some objections or reasons why people might not be so warm to this idea of distance or online education for students?
Well, the most common objection is that all the schools that do this are diploma mills. They're not legitimate schools. They're just charging people to give them, a piece of paper that doesn't prove anything. Right. And while there are small numbers of schools who do work that way, by and large, it's not the truth, because they're actually fully accredited schools that do all their courses online. So you can earn a degree entirely online through a nationally accredited school. So that's the thing to watch out for, though, is make sure whatever school you're taking courses from is accredited. Right. Because that way you know that they're legitimate and it's not just a fly-by-night organization.
Absolutely.
There's actually a group called the Distance Education Accrediting Commission that their sole job is to accredit schools that do distance education. So that's a great resource to check out if you're researching schools.
Yeah. And again, there's this spectrum, right? There might be schools that offer 100% online education, but then there are schools that exist in an actual building and you could go there to get your degree, right? But then they also have online options, which is nice. So you could, be attending a school which exists somewhere physically in Texas, but maybe you never actually go to that campus because you are doing all of your classes online, or you visit the campus sometimes. So, again, I think it's important to realize that these objections that we might have, that it's not legit, that's not always the case. I think especially now as there are people, monitoring and accrediting these schools, which is great.
That's true. And another objection that people always seem to have is, well, if you're a student in a distance ed course, you can just slack off.
Right.
Like you can just hang out at home in your pajamas and watch TV and just put in the minimal amount of effort to pass this course.
Yeah.
And that's certainly not true either.
No, I laugh at that because as we were talking before, I used to teach in a master's program and I taught the same courses both on site and online. And the online classes were harder. It was the same content, but the way in which we sort of challenged these students and expected them to show up and show that they were actually involved in the class, and the ways they had to sort of, confirm their participation, I actually think it was harder. It was great that they had that option because it meant that they didn't have to, relocate their lives to the Bay Area, which is where the program actually lived. Or if they were busy working, they had these options. But yeah, I actually think that the online classes in a lot of ways end up being a bigger challenge. And that's important for students to know as they go into them, that, this is not just a walk in the park.
Right. You're actually going to be expected to complete the coursework, to pass the exams. Like there are expectations of you that you have to meet. So, and I experienced that firsthand too, because I did distance education for a good part of my college degree. And for some of that, we actually had to go to a physical location and take the exam under a proctor to make sure that we weren't, looking, if it was a closed book exam, that we weren't actually looking stuff up on the side. So they always have ways to make sure that as a student, you're still doing the work.
Yeah. Yeah, which is good because it's education and it shouldn't be a walk in the park. And I think as a student or as an administrator, you don't want someone getting a degree from your same school that didn't have to do, the same sort of work that you did. So I think finding ways to make it, consistent. Obviously, there has to be some differences because you can't do exactly the same things online as you can in a classroom, but making it consistent across the board is really great. Now, we've kind of already touched on this, but what are some of the benefits, do you think, of including online education at the high school level?
Well, one huge benefit is prep for college because a lot of colleges are doing coursework online now. Right. So you might as well start learning how to do it in high school. Another one is, not every student is going to be able to get to school as easily.
Right.
So if a student's having trouble getting to school, either due to physical handicap or just due to unavailability of transportation, maybe they're out in the country and the school bus doesn't go to them or something, this is another option for them to do at least part of their coursework online and save them that commute.
Yeah.
So that's another benefit.
Yeah, I love that. As a parent, I love that it gives everyone the opportunity to have that education. Obviously, you need to have access still, right? You need to have a computer, you need to have internet. So there may be some potential barriers, but it takes away that barrier of actually physically getting to school. Or if someone suffers with severe anxiety and, wants to learn and wants to get the education, but is struggling to get into the classroom and be there and be able to learn, isn't that amazing as a parent that you would have these options that your student can still get the education and their degree? And I think, also, again, as a former instructor of these classes, you're able to tap into people's different learning styles. If someone is a very visual learner, I think, some teachers don't put the PowerPoints together, right? They just they get up there and they talk. And if you're a visual learner, that can be very hard to follow. But in an online class, chances are there's PowerPoints, there's notes available to you. So I think it touches on those different learning styles differently than, you might in a traditional classroom.
Yeah, it's also great preparation for learning how to study on your own.
So true.
And that's something that homeschoolers learn anyway, just because they have to. But But if you're in a public or private school setting and you have the opportunity to do a distance education course in high school, I strongly recommend you give it a shot, because that experience is more representative of what you'll be doing in college.
Right.
Because you're given tasks and you're pretty much left to do them on your own, and then you have to show your results. And it's very much more a real world experience, because that's what you're going to have to do in a job as well.
Absolutely. It's interesting. So my kids are young. My older son is just starting first grade, but I'm in one of those, Facebook parent groups for our district. And there's lots of talk in this area about our high school and kids being sort of forced to take these online classes and parents getting frustrated. And I'm thinking, this is kind of great. Like, it's great that you have this option. When we're dealing with impacted schools, the fact that your child doesn't have to go and sit, crammed into a room and a teacher's trying to teach all of these kids, and instead they can learn more so, not always on their own pace, because these classes do still move forward, but they can take the additional time. If they're feeling a little unfocused, they can pause the lecture and, go take a break and come back to it. And like you said, it really prepares them for what's to come in college and the real world. So I stay out of these conversations, but part of me is going, I think this is really great that there are these options and that students can do it. I know it's hard for parents to navigate because we don't always understand it, and it's not always something that we experienced growing up, and that lack of familiarity can be uncomfortable. But I think it's great. And another point that came to mind for me is, I think for families who are considering homeschooling, I could see where it might feel intimidating as your kids get older. Can I handle teaching them all of this material and taking responsibility? And so I think that the ability to enroll them in an online class takes that pressure off of you as a parent, which is nice.
Yes, it does. And especially when it comes to courses like high school level math or science. I know my experience was I did several math courses at the time. They didn't offer it online, but they sent us VHS tapes, and I would watch the tapes and then take the tests. My brother, he actually went to co-op classes where they'd be distanced through the week, and then one day a week he would go in with another group of students, and they'd actually learn from a scientist. So there's all sorts of options. The great thing about this is you're no longer stuck with the static model of you walk to school, you sit in your chair, you listen to the teacher, and then you walk home. There's so many other ways to do it now, and it's a lot more creative.
Right. Well, and you even mentioned before we started this episode that you did some computer-based classes, right? And you were able to sort of breeze through them because you were familiar, whereas in a classroom, you wouldn't be able to do that. So can you speak to that a little bit more about another benefit?
Yeah, well, I was really into computers when I was a kid, so I learned a lot on my own. And then when I got to college, I decided to study computers in college, and a lot of the courses had stuff in them that I already knew.
Yeah.
So it was nice having the distance option there, because I could pick courses that I knew, and I could pretty much breeze through them, get the credit without having to sit in class and then, listen to somebody teach stuff that I already knew.
Right.
So it was kind of a way to do a CLEP exam or test out of a course without actually testing out. So I was still able to watch the lectures if I wanted to. But if I wanted to skip them and just go straight to the tests, that was always an option too. So it was really nice.
Yeah. And I think, whether it's high school or college, if you're in a class where you already know it, you're checking out, right? You're not interested. You're annoyed that you have to be there. You might become disruptive. You might literally just not go to class. And then I think it sets that student and that family and that teacher up for all sorts of potential issues. But you take that barrier out of it. Yes, they still have to take the class, but if they can do it online and go through it in their own way, that's pretty great for everybody.
Absolutely.
So obviously there's lots of benefits to having the ability for students to take online courses. But if we have, administrators, teachers from private schools listening today, and their wheels are kind of turning, why would a private school want to offer their own online classes?
Well, for one thing, a lot of students are wanting that now. So you're just going to increase the number of students who want to come to your school if you begin offering things that way. Second is, it is the trend. and it's not going away anytime soon. So the sooner your school can get on board with it, at least dip your foot in the water and start teaching your staff how to deal with this stuff, and get the technology going. The sooner you can do all that, then the better. The more ahead your school will be in the long run, because at some point or another, you're probably going to have to start offering stuff like this.
Right. And I think, like you said, it expands your ability to reach to other students, right, whose schools may not have those offerings, or who are doing homeschool and their parent says, I can't teach you geometry. We need to find you a class. So you can now be the school that family utilizes, but also it increases the student satisfaction for your students, and it makes your school more appealing overall. Part of what I also really love about online education is as a school, it allows you to tap into other instructors, because those online educators don't have to be coming to your campus.
Exactly. Yep.
And as someone who taught online classes, I loved that I didn't live that far from the school, but Bay Area traffic makes things harder. So I loved that I didn't have to travel to campus to teach this class. I could, hop on the computer at 3 p.m. and check, or if that day got busy, I'm checking in later at night. So, I think that you also create happy instructors, and that's really important. When you are working with students, you want your instructors to be enjoying what it is that they're doing. And so I think that can be a nice change, but also, again, you just have more options for who can teach these courses, especially if you're offering specialty courses to your students.
I think you can end up with happier students too, because I don't know about you, but I preferred to do courses online versus sitting in a classroom. I mean, part of it was my personality, but it was just more enjoyable for me to do it that way. And also something to think about for schools who are considering this is just your reach. If you're only offering courses where people have to physically be there, you have a very limited geographical reach. Whereas a school like Orion, Dr. Gallegos was on a previous podcast, maybe we can link to.
We will.
They're based in Texas, but he can basically bring in students from anywhere in the country, because all of their courses are online. So he's not limited to one geographical area, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. So if now, an administrator's wheels are turning and they're thinking, okay, there's obviously benefits to online education. I feel like maybe we should, start offering these classes. What are some things that a school needs to be aware of if they're moving in this direction?
Well, getting the technology right is obviously crucial.
Yes.
And you don't want to try to go too cheap in that area, I guess.
Right. You also have to test things out. I'm laughing because, so I taught in a master's program. And as I said to you before we hit record, we were basically told your program will be online. And we were like, I don't know about that, but I guess we have to. So, we went through and we figured it out, and we called ourselves trailblazers, and we tried to figure out the tech side. And there were so many times that we hosted, live community meetings and we couldn't get our camera to work, or, there was a live class and, the platform was down. I mean, even I think when you get that tech figured out, there are tech issues. So you have to be prepared. How are we going to handle this so that we're best serving our students? Because I'm laughing now, but at the time it was so stressful and frustrating.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Well, the great news is, if you're looking into this, there are existing software platforms out there that specialize in distance education.
Yes.
So you don't necessarily need to put something together from scratch. I mean, you can if you want to, but
don't do it. Don't do it. We were the trailblazers, but I do not recommend blazing that trail. Use what exists.
Yeah. Like I know when I was doing distance ed, there was a software called Blackboard that they used. I'm not sure if they're still called Blackboard, or
I think they changed
it's
to
been
something.
A while.
Yeah, things evolve. But anyway, yes. Blackboard was I think one of the earlier options. But again, having that tech is so important so that you can do things like having live components to your classes, right? Remembering that it doesn't have to be all asynchronous learning. You can actually be together with your students. and thinking really creatively about how can we get this information to them and how can they show that they've learned it. Because I think in the beginning for me, I felt like, well, here are my assignments that are in my onsite class. So these should be repeated online. It should look the same. It needs to be fair and equitable. And that's not necessarily the case. The learning outcomes should be very consistent, but how an online student learns and shows their understanding is likely different than how an on-site student learns and shows their understanding.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, one other thing that, again, if schools are thinking about doing this, I've found it's really important to be clear on expectations for your students and your instructors. So once you get that tech set up, your instructors have their course designed, I think it's important to be clear with your instructors. How much time are you spending teaching this online class? Because if someone has not taught online, they tend to think it runs itself, which it doesn't. Sure. Just because the class is online doesn't mean you're like, I'm fine, I'll grade a few things and, I'll see you at the end of the quarter or semester. I feel you have to be almost more involved online for your students to get a good experience than you might in a traditional classroom, because you're seeing them and you're interacting. So you kind of have to go above and beyond to learn who your students are, to communicate with them. So I find having those really clear expectations for your faculty and for your students in terms of involvement, assignments, have really clear rubrics, all of that is helpful to have everyone have a really good experience.
Yeah, don't be afraid to have high expectations for your students, especially because, I took some courses and it was clear the instructor had checked out.
Yeah.
But the courses that were really valuable were the ones where it was clear the instructor expected us to show up, when we were doing online calls and that kind of thing. And there were, requirements that we had to meet or else we were going to be dropped from the course.
Yeah.
So, don't be afraid to keep the expectations for online learning should be, just as high, if not higher than for traditional classroom learning.
Absolutely. And one more point to keep in mind that, as I'm kind of talking about this and reliving some of these things that I went through, is I found that, again, this is a master's program, but I think it might be true of high schoolers, is the ones that tend to take online education classes, they're doing so for a reason. Right? Whether it's they're just really busy and can't fit in this extra class, or there's something going on at home and they're not able to get to school. They don't have reliable transportation that impacts them in some way. So there's probably a reason why your students are choosing your online courses. And so again, from an instructor's perspective, I think it's important to keep that in mind. I found that, from a time management standpoint, online students really need to be good at that. And sometimes they're not. They realize, I have this option that I can do because I'm so busy and this makes sense, but then they're not necessarily prepared for how to fit that in. So if you find that one of your students is struggling, I think you need to sort of check in more proactively sometimes than you might in a traditional learning space. But yeah, I found that in general, the students who signed up for online classes are already very busy and they're passionate about school and want to learn, but they have a lot going on. So that may not be quite as accurate in the high school space. But again, I think people choose online courses for a reason, and it's important to know what that is.
Yeah, that's true. I'm curious, since you've been involved in this, how many students were in a traditional online class? So
when we first started, some of them were small. I mean, we had classes that were maybe 8 to 10 students. And then as the program grew, and so this was a sports psychology program, and as the online component grew and people realized they didn't need to come to the Bay Area, there were classes up to 24 students. And so at our university, they would split it when it got higher than 24. But yeah, so I'd say 24 was the max in a class. And then if it tipped at that point, they'd usually break it up into 2 sections. But that was too much from an instructor's perspective. And this was applied sports psychology. So it's very, you're hands-on, you're working with people. There was a lot of interaction. As an instructor, it felt like too much. So I also think you have to be thoughtful about what the class size is and, adjust that from what the traditional classroom capacity is potentially.
Yeah, that was my experience as well, because I was in classes with, closer to 10 students, and that felt like we got a lot more instructor attention.
Yeah.
Versus
I'd say
the classes with 20 spot. Or more.
Yeah, for sure. And again, I think it depends on, what the course is and how it's set up. If it's more of an introductory level course, that compared to an on-site class might be more lecture, right? That maybe you can get away with a larger class size. But if it's more of an interactive class, if you're really wanting people to be able to apply the information, I think smaller numbers is more ideal typically.
And I will say this, it was a pet peeve of mine. And if you're a school considering doing this, make sure your instructors are responsive to the students, because there was nothing worse than being enrolled in an online course and we have deadlines coming up and tests we need to fill out. And we would submit questions to the instructor who also had traditional classes he was doing. And it was clear that the online class was not his priority. And, we would get answers weeks later. Oh. And that was a very frustrating position to be in.
Yeah. That's unacceptable. And I will say too, that it took me a while as an online instructor to realize that I actually needed to be more proactive with my communication with my online students. In my mind, I'm like, well, it's in the syllabus. They can read and they do. But, in my regular class, I'd be like, okay, just a reminder, this is due next week. Right. And so I was giving them extra assistance, but online at first I was resistant to sending that extra email that was, here's the weekly announcements. Here's what you need to be doing. Cause I felt like they're adults, it's micromanaging them. This isn't appropriate from my standpoint. This is frustrating, but I realized you need to have ongoing, proactive, even over communication with online students because it's just different. And so, I agree. You need to set that expectation for your faculty because we don't always realize it. You might be a fantastic instructor on site, and that doesn't always translate to being a fantastic online instructor, especially in the beginning, because there can be a strong learning curve.
Exactly. Yep.
So I have one final question for you. So schools that are offering both on what we would call on-site and online classes, does that need to be differentiated on a transcript? Are we talking like I need a little asterisk now that says I took this course online?
No, they can show up just the same way as any other course. It's the same thing. The only exception would be if the distance courses were transferred from another institution. Right. Sometimes you might want to note that because when I did my own distance education program, I did take some of those courses through different schools, and marking which schools those came from is always a good idea. But if they were all taken at the same school, there's no reason to mark them any differently.
Right. And I think that's, again, good mentally as the school to know that these courses shouldn't be that different. If it's the same course title, it should be the same content. It might be taught a little differently. The outcomes in terms of what the students develop and provide for showing their understanding of knowledge might be different, but the outcomes of learning shouldn't be different. And, as we said, sometimes I've found that the online students actually grasp the information better and can show their learning more strongly because they had to. The way we taught was different and was challenging for them. And so they actually learned a lot more, I think, and took it more seriously. So for anyone who's, again, on the fence or has those objections, hopefully we've shown that online education can be a really great option for students and for your school.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Matt. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Today, I feel like we just scratched the surface of why online education really is a good option and why it can make sense for private schools to begin offering their own courses. So I hope we've shed some light for you and maybe got those wheels turning about some changes you'd like to make and how you offer your courses. So don't forget that you can sign up for 14 days free of Transcript Maker and that you do not need to put that little asterisk to note that your class is online versus on-site. They're all the same. And if you would like more from us, you can also sign up for our newsletter so that you are notified of these podcasts, blog posts, and more.